Hello everyone and welcome to the Winecast. I was in a bit of a lighthearted mood when contemplating the topic for this cast, and thought it might be fun to cover a bit of wine trivia that probably isn't essential to your experience as a wine consumer, but is still interesting and fun to trot out at parties or anywhere else you might have a glass of the grape in your hand. So with that in mind, let's talk about wine bottles. If you've spent any time around wine shops or even the wine section of most supermarkets, you've come across off-sized bottles. Some larger than standard, some smaller. They're rare and only a small fraction of the wine produced every year ends up in them, but when you do come across them, they usually make an impression, and they have their own names and lore behind them. But before we look more closely at off-size bottles, let's have a look at the standard. The International Standard Wine bottle holds 750 milliliters, or 3/4 of a liter of wine, or just about 1/5 of a U.S. gallon of wine. This means, incidentally, that a standard 60-gallon barrel of wine holds enough wine to fill about 300 bottles, and at 12 bottles per case of wine, about 25 cases. So how did the 750 milliliter bottle come to rule the roost? Well, it's hard to overlook the convenience of this size from several different perspectives. It's undeniable that bottles of this size are easy to store in large numbers and in tight spaces, making it a great size for cellaring a large volume of wine. Also, some wine styles, notably traditional method sparkling wines like champagne or cava, require producers to spend some time manipulating the bottle while they're in the cellar, and a 750 milliliter bottle is an easy size to deal with. From the point of view of consumers, most wine drinkers typically only have a glass or two of wine with a meal, making this an ideal bottle to break out and drink over the course of a dinner for two, or with a couple of friends. And if you're drinking alone, then you can finish a standard bottle over the course of a couple of days with minimal waste. Finally, it's a handy size to get from the wine shop or grocery store to home, and it fits nicely in a shopping bag. So, when do you see the other sizes? Mostly at festive occasions, weddings, parties, and the occasional launch of a ship, that sort of thing. It's no denying a large bottle is impressive and fun, and that seems to be why some of the really large ones were designed in the first place. When it comes to bottle size, there are two main styles: Bordeaux and Champagne. The major difference between them is the shape of the bottle, with Bordeaux bottles, pictured on the left, having pronounced shoulders to help them catch sediment during decanting, and Champagne bottles on the right, which contain wines that don't usually throw sediment, having less pronounced, more gently sloped shoulders. There's a tradition, the origin of which is obscure, of giving fanciful names to some of these off-size bottles, and while there's a lot of overlap, there are some noticeable differences between some of the names depending on whether we're talking about Bordeaux or Champagne bottles. Let's have a look at the most common off-size bottles that you're likely to run into. To keep things as simple as possible, we'll go through the Bordeaux terminology, and where it differs from Champagne, I'll point that out. The demi or half bottle is exactly what it sounds like, and holds 375 milliliters, half of a standard bottle. I've been told that demi is the Bordeaux term and half should be reserved for ordering bottles of champagne or other sparkling wines. There may be some history behind that, but my impression is that these days the terms have become interchangeable. Next up is the standard 750 milliliter bottle, and we've already sung its praises. The step up from standard is called a magnum and holds twice as much as a standard bottle, or 1.5 liters. From the magnum, the next bottle up is the imaginatively named double magnum that clocks in at 3 liters of wine, or 4 standard bottles. To the credit of the good folks in Champagne, they put a little more thought into naming this size, and they call it a Jeroboam, after the king of the northern kingdom of ancient Israel. The name Jeroboam starts off the tradition of naming these bottles after biblical figures, primarily, but not exclusively, kings. Just to keep things interesting, or confusing depending on your point of view, the next bottle up is called a Jeroboam in Bordeaux, which is what we just learned the Champenois call a double magnum, while the Champenois call this size bottle a Rehoboam, who was Jeroboam's rival, the king of the southern kingdom of Israel and the son of the famous biblical king Solomon. The Jeroboam Rehoboam holds 4.5 liters, the equivalent of 6 bottles. The next bottle is the Imperial in Bordeaux and the Methuselah in Champagne, named not for a biblical king but for the oldest man in the Hebrew Bible. This bottle holds the equivalent of 8 standard bottles, or 6 liters. By now you should see a pattern. Starting with the magnum, you move from bottle to bottle by adding the equivalent of another magnum. Unfortunately, this pattern changes a little for the final 3 bottles, but it's consistent from magnum through Imperial Methuselah. The next bottle is the 9-liter 12-bottle Salmanazar, named after an ancient king who appears in the Bible. To get from an Imperial or Methuselah to a Salmanazar, you need to add the equivalent of 2 magnums or 4 bottles, and this pattern will continue over the next 2 bottles. Up from the Salmanazar is the 16-bottle 12-liter Balthazar, named for one of the 3 wise men of the Christian tradition. And the final bottle that you're likely to encounter is the 20-bottle 15-liter Nebuchadnezzar, named for another biblical king. As we saw, there are some definite patterns to the progression from one bottle to the next in terms of volume. And seeing the bottles in chart form might be helpful to make those patterns more obvious. You can also see here that the names remain remarkably consistent between the 2 styles, with the exception of a 3-bottle stretch here. And of course, there's the confusing use of Jeroboam that I've highlighted in red for 2 different sizes. These are the major offsized bottles that you might run into. But are there any other ones? Yeah, lots of them. But here are a few that you might also come across. The Picolo, called a pony or a split as well, is a quarter bottle, and you really are only going to see this for champagnes and other sparklers. The Jenny is a 500 milliliter bottle, about 2/3 of a standard bottle, that's used for Sauterne, Tokai, and other dessert wines. And quite a few Austrian wines are sold in 1-liter bottles. The Melchior, holding 24 bottles of wine, is the last sized bottle shared by both Bordeaux and Champagne, with anything after that reserved for sparkling wines. Like the 2 final bottles that I'll mention, the Goliath or Prima and the Melchizedek or Midas, clocking in at 36 and 40 bottles worth of wine, respectively. So I'll be the first to admit that memorizing the names of all these bottles is a bit of a party trick, and no wine professional is going to think less of you if you have to look up where in the bottle hierarchy a Salmanazar sits relative to an Imperial. But if you like a challenge, you can memorize the order, and a good mnemonic never hurt anyone. I figure everyone can remember a half bottle into standard, so from Magnum on, the initials for Bordeaux bottles are MDMJISBN. So maybe Mary drank mint juleps and silky braided nightgowns? I don't know if I'm feeling that one. Many dead magician jokes invite severely biased naysaying? I might be feeling that one even a little bit less. Or my digestive malady just isn't so bad now. I don't know if I really feel any of these, and that last one might be too much information. So I'll tell you what, if you can think of better ones, leave them in the comments. Now for champagne bottles, it's MJRMSBM. Maybe most jurors reason more soundly before noon? I actually kind of like that one, so I'm going to run with it. But again, feel free to leave other ideas in the comments. So the question we've all been waiting for, does size matter? Yes, it turns out it does, but in 2 different ways. One of them's good, and one of them not so good. Though they're hard to store and might just cost you a little more than 2 separate bottles of still wine, the general consensus among wine lovers is that magnums age still wine better than standard 750 milliliter bottles do. It's probably a function of the ratio of air to wine in a magnum bottle versus another sized bottle, but wine kept in magnums seems to mature at as close to an optimal pace as you're likely to see. At least that's the word on the street. By contrast, magnums and larger bottles are not considered the great friends of sparkling wine. Bottles of traditional method sparkling wines like champagne or cava go through a process of manipulation in the cellar called riddling. And this process is just too cumbersome to do with larger or even smaller than standard sized bottles. So the wine is riddled in standard bottles and then dumped into a tank and then refilled into off-sized bottles, causing the wine to have greater exposure to air than it would have had it remained in standard sized bottles. This additional exposure is thought to cut down on the life of the bubbly in the bottle. So the takeaway, if you can afford to snag a magnum or 2 of something age-worthy and want to sit on it, do so, as long as it's a still wine. But if you want the best, if not necessarily the flashiest experience with the bubbly, stick to the standard bottles. Thanks for joining me for another Winecast. If you found this cast interesting and informative, please like or subscribe if you haven't already. I always look forward to comments, but I'd especially like to hear any of your mnemonics for remembering bottle sizes, so please don't hesitate to leave those below. I'm your host, the Unknown Winecaster, and I'm out. Enjoy the grape, but always enjoy it responsibly.